Welcome to Hello Unknown, a podcast exploring the hidden parts of the human experience. I'm Jonathan Wright. Today, our final episode of Season 2, The Cost. It's 1920, and Bermudians are upset. For context, Bermuda, the country, it's tiny. Its total area is around 53 kilometers, or 20 miles squared. Its current population is 63,000. It was 20,000 in 1920. So, this small country, this series of low islands vaguely shaped like a fishhook, is starting to get congested. It's carts, carriages, bikes, horses, and a lot of horse manure. There are no cars. Bermudians are a little odd. They like the idea of separation, both physical and cultural, from the mainland. They're aware of their unique culture, the pastel-colored houses with terraced roofs, the taboo of swimming before Bermuda Day on May 24th, the banning of chain restaurants, still true, except for some reason a single KFC in downtown Hamilton, and also no cars, at least in 1920. So Bermuda is getting plugged up. There aren't many options for getting around, and now tourism in Bermuda is becoming increasingly important. Cruise ships are finding their stride, carrying tens of thousands of Americans and Canadians to Bermuda every year. And so the hotels and cruise lines are beginning to put pressure on the Bermuda government to solve this transportation problem, the carts and carriages and the mounds of horse poop. And on August 4th, 1924, what they choose is a railroad. So, I'm a lawyer. I remember when I was first allowed to say it. I'm a lawyer. Before that, I was an articling student. It's basically a mini lawyer, but no one knows that. And I was sensitive about it. I felt the need to explain at length. A border guard sneered at me once when I told him I was an articling student. I'll be a lawyer soon, I wanted to plead. But somehow I maintained my dignity. I stayed silent, and he let me pass through. So, when I could finally say it, lawyer, it meant something. I'd wanted it for a really long time. Now I had it. Lawyer, the word, was a label I wore proudly. It felt special to me. If asked at parties, what do you do? I could say, I'm a lawyer. And whether or not you like us lawyers, and many do not, no one asks me, okay, what's a lawyer? Everyone knows. It happened for me on September 4th, 2013. The ceremony is the call to the bar being the railing at the back of the courtroom that separates the lawyers and judges, plaintiffs and defendants from you, the unwashed and uneducated. They dressed us up in long black barrister robes, which I had to rent for the day. We didn't have the white wigs with the curls at the sides, but that was the sort of feeling I got, the vibe of the ceremony. Whatever. I went along with it. I would be a lawyer. That day, when I got back to my firm, I remember a couple lawyers asking me if I felt different. It's the sort of question you ask on a child's birthday. You know, whether they feel older. That sort of gentle condescension. But yeah, I did. I did feel different. Like the black barrister robes, I was trying on something new. An identity, and I liked it. With all that came with it, with all the benefits and prestige and all the costs, I was a lawyer. So, Google it. Open Google Maps and take a look at Bermuda. If your first thought, looking at this series of disconnected islands, is a railroad, then you would not be alone. There were objectors from the beginning, some of them quite prescient. One parliamentarian noted that the Jamaican railway had failed under similar conditions. Another said that, as a commercial venture, it would never pay out. So why start? And a third had the idea, admittedly more 17th century than 1920, for a, quote, proper horse bus service. So these were the issues, among others. First, geology. The island is low. The highest point, Town Hill, is just 260 feet above sea level, but it's definitely not flat. Rail cars are Goldilocks in their choice of railway. Not too curvy, not too steep. Straight and flat is just right. So, to have a proper railroad in Bermuda, embankments would need to be cut, rock blasted, tunnels drilled through limestone. But there are more complicated issues also. For very obvious reasons, one continuous line would be required. The railroad would run all the way across the country, from tip to tip, a span of 21 miles, which seems short compared to, a railroad across the United States. But not all Bermuda is land. Expensive bridges would need to be strung across the island, and also, in Bermuda, basically all the land was taken up already. They'd need to purchase a measurable part of the entire island. And in circumstances where deals couldn't be reached, which absolutely did happen, at considerable expense, they'd have to shift the railway off the island, with parts of it perched on trestles that followed the shoreline a little ways out. But no matter. The A's in Parliament, they had a majority. After debate, they won, and the statute, the Bermuda Railway Company Act, was enacted, creating the company and authorizing it to sell £500,000 in stock to investors. That was their estimate of the cost. But the true cost? A little more. In the end, mile for mile, it was the most expensive railroad that the world had ever seen. A record which stands to this day. My railroad was law. Law, being a lawyer, involves a trade-off. So a client comes to me, she asks for an opinion, or a corporate structure, estate plan, a trust, whatever. She asks for something legal, and I plan it out, I write it up, and I hand it over. Then I send her a bill, and I get paid. But what have I given her? Like, really? I'm not building anything, of course. It's nothing physical. I'm not making anything with my hands, which is good because I have no idea how to make things with my hands. What I offer and what my clients paid for, what I'm trading for money, is actually, for me, kind of frightening. Let me explain. I didn't realize it at first. In June of 2015, I left the firm I'd practiced at for my entire, technically 3-year career at the time, and I started my own firm, completely on my own. It was going to be Right Law, but my wife convinced me otherwise. I called it Right Legal. I rented space from a mergers and acquisitions firm in downtown Vancouver so I could look like I was big time, even though I wasn't. I remember that awkwardness. I'd have to convince people that I knew what I was doing, even though maybe I'd never drafted that sort of trust or answered that particular tax question. I had to figure it out. I offered a sort of insurance. Lawmakers write laws. They tell us how to conduct our business, when to pay tax, and how you can legally avoid it. And I, the lawyer, know the laws and draft your documents so that your business can operate like it's supposed to. And if I screw up, you can sue me. That was what I didn't quite grasp at the beginning, the extent of it. How, as I took on bigger and bigger clients, I was taking on bigger and bigger risk. That crept up on me, slowly, the realization of the nature of my job, that I trade risk for money. Every job is a little bit of risk, or maybe a lot of risk, and in return for taking on that risk, I get paid. Eventually, it dawned on me. I've taken on some big clients, answered some pretty big questions. Other firms take on much larger files, orders of magnitude bigger, but I was conscious, it's just me. Increasingly, I felt this pressure. I had to be perfect. I had to know the laws and interpret them perfectly. That was the issue. So even as my business starts taking off, the liability is increasing along with it, and I start to become obsessive. I've spoken in an earlier episode about my OCD, and of course, what I felt about law, about my railroad, that I had to be perfect, that any mistake would be a disaster. That didn't help. I became obsessed with checking for my mistakes, obsessed with finding errors, obsessive about detail, about getting things right, about being completely and without exception perfect. As perfect as I felt I needed to be as a lawyer, building this law firm that would succeed or fail based on my efforts alone. And increasingly, despite my love for my clients and some real, genuine enjoyment in the work, I was terrified. There's more after a quick break. During the Pleistocene era, which ended about 12,000 years ago, a significant part of the Earth's oceans were locked up in ice at the poles. The result was much lower sea levels compared to what we have today, exposing quite a bit of land that now lies submerged. One result of this? Bermuda was bigger. It was estimated to be 10 times larger then, and these fragmented islands were more or less a single larger whole, which, would have made building a railroad a bit easier. And it's fair to say the Pleistocene era of podcasts also ended about 12,000 years ago. There are so many podcasts out there, and only the most popular actually rise above the water. So, you know where I'm going. If you enjoy Hello Unknown, you can help us stick out by spreading the word. Rate, leave a review, text your friends, steal their phones, and subscribe them to Hello Unknown. Thank you all. Back to the show. The first half of the Bermuda Railway was completed in October of 1931. On Halloween, the first locomotive set off, passing through rows of Bermuda cedars, crawling over the Somerset Railway Bridge, blue water below, or cutting through the ancient limestone along West Main Road. Bermudians and tourists finally had modern transport, free of carts and horse poop, a railway to carry them at least halfway then across the island, with the other half being completed shortly thereafter. The difference between 1925 and 1931 was an idea versus reality. Once the railway was built, the fact of its existence gave it a certain aura of permanence, this feeling of momentum. So, when things started going wrong, there was no question about whether the railway was ever actually a good idea. It wasn't an idea anymore. There it was. They'd have to make the best of it. Because already things were going wrong. Everything was just breaking. The railroad was constantly under repair. As equipment deteriorated, more capital was needed for replacement. Vehicles soon needed to be switched out. Then it was the tracks. Apparently much of the wood had been pre-treated prior to arrival in Bermuda. When it was cut again on arrival, it was not retreated, and salty air quickly began eating it away. It was fairly uncomfortable too, and extremely slow. The first half of the line was a 44-minute trip for about 10 miles. The locals soon nicknamed it the Rattle and Shake, and the end result, really the most vital thing, was that Bermudians weren't using it. Historian David Rain explains this, quote, "Most St. David's Islanders continued to use their boats. Folk from Ireland and Watford Islands tended to stick with the ferries. Those with homes out at Tuckerstown used their carriages. From Devil's Hole, they cycled. The reality of it was that the majority of the population of Bermuda rarely used the railway, if at all." Tourists could provide some revenue, but every business needs its regulars. The business of the Bermuda Railway Company was collapsing. Later, ridership does pick up a bit. It's during the Second World War, when Bermuda became a major port for English soldiers. There was a significant temporary increase in the population of the small island, which, in turn, meant more money in ticket sales. But in the end, the war probably accelerated the decline. The tickets from these soldiers also meant the increased, rapid destruction of this hapless little railway. Army boots destroyed the flooring, rifle butts scarred the armrests, the chairs in the cars were made of wicker, swinging bags, crates of munitions, they took the cabins apart. And so this slow, uncomfortable railway, already avoided by locals, became more unpleasant to ride. And as the railway deteriorated, there was just no money to fix it. And anyway, because of the war, there were no materials to fix it with. In February of 1946, the company paid engineers from New York to make a thorough review of the line, putting together estimates of the cost for necessary repairs. It was dire. More than half of the 33 bridges on the island had to be completely replaced. A full 50% of the track had deteriorated, as well as 85% of the track caps and nearly all the wood in the trestles, sitting there, rotting, since they were laid down a couple of decades ago. The cost to restore the railway to its original condition, a condition, I will remind you, that wasn't great in the first place, would be $850,000. In today's dollars, $14 million. That was the cost to continue. So, they called it. The 25-year experiment with railway on Bermuda was over. The Times of London announced that the railway company had agreed to sell its assets to the government of Bermuda, with the estimate that the investors would receive 37.5 cents on the dollar for their investment. Parliament purchased the rolling stock from the Bermuda Railway Company. The railway was dismantled, and then it was sold on to British Guyana, leaving a long, mostly empty space from one tip of the island nation to the other, where a railroad once ran. So, I had a broken railroad. It was broken, and as I continued on and my business grew and I started getting more and bigger clients, it only got worse. The difference for me between 2015 and 2022 was idea versus reality. Like the Bermuda Railway, once I had my firm, once I had my clients and my income, my daily rhythm, the fact of it gave it that aura of permanence, unquestionability. So despite my fear, I never really questioned it, because in my mind, I never really had any alternatives. I'd done this thing. I'd made it. What else would I do? I was, in a way, trapped by what I built. I have a family, a wife, 2 kids. We have a house with a mortgage. And my side job, it's a podcast, which, to date of writing, has made $3. Thank you, Benji Wegler. So, was Right Legal a good idea? I don't know. It didn't matter, because it wasn't an idea. It was real. It was my law firm. And then, I went to Bermuda. In season 1, I have a revelation in Hawaii. On this vacation, I'm sorry, it didn't happen. Not just yet. But it was amazing. It was 2022 in May. It was the first time away since the pandemic began, and I got to go to Bermuda. It worked out just perfectly. My parents have friends in Bermuda, this married couple. They were visiting the United States to see their son get married, and they offered their home to us. We did all the Bermuda touristy things. We swam, poked our toes in the pink sand, this pale white tinged with red specks, limestone, and apparently the shells of a creature called the red forum, and walked past the cruise ship bros, including one, aged 21 or so, who was looking around at the water and the sand and the rock formations and turned to his friends and said, "Dude, this looks like a screensaver." And it did. It did look like a screensaver. So, all that, and I ran on a trail. It stretches, more or less, all the way across the island. Takes you on a dirt path through the forest, palm trees and jungle ferns, lizards and birds and chirping frogs, then onto a narrow paved street lined with houses, and then a main road and back to the forest. It's more of a route than a trail, but it follows the historical path of a railway. In the 1980s, a citizens group had started agitating. There was this strip of land covered by a right-of-way that sat more or less unused. Though by this time, much of it had been converted into roads, there were still large stretches, basically untouched since the collapse of the railway decades before, and they had no desire to see it just sit there. They won out. In July of 1984, on Bermuda's 375th birthday, the route was revived. Under the jurisdiction of Bermuda's Ministry of Public Works and Engineering, the narrow span of land from one side of Bermuda to the other became the Bermuda Railway Trail, which I ran on my vacation. And then, 2 weeks after I got home, I quit law. It felt sudden, but it wasn't, really. I'd managed to ignore the increasing cost of this broken railroad for a number of years. Eventually, I guess, I just couldn't anymore. After getting back from Bermuda, it's a miserable early June in Vancouver, just rainy and cold. But then there's a brief respite, one day, a beautiful Saturday. My wife asked me to drive a little ways out of town in her dad's pickup truck to pick up a sink for our upcoming renovation. So I drive out in the sun, and I get there, and I text the guy selling us the sink, and I wait, and eventually he says he's running late. Okay, so instead of just waiting in the hot cab, I get out, and I climb up into the back of the pickup, and I lie there in the sun. And as I'm lying there, I say it. I say the words, I don't want to do law anymore. I'd said those words before. It wasn't the first time. But that moment was somehow different. I was quitting, and I knew it. I felt it somewhere. So I said this to myself, and in that moment, I looked up and I saw around the sun a ring. It's a natural phenomenon. It's called the sun halo. I searched it on the web later. In the mythology of one African nation, it's considered a sign of great change. It occurs when sunlight passes through a thin layer of ice particles in cirrus clouds, and also when a lawyer decides he will no longer practice law. 3 months after making my decision, I sold Right Legal. It's not the end of the story. I was not offered retirement money, not even close. Not that I'd really retire if I was, but there's obviously more for me, for my work life. So, here I am. I'm living the unknown. Hello, buddy. I don't know what I'll do. I don't know where I'll end up, but mostly, I'm not afraid. The time now is for ideas. The cost, that comes later. Thanks for listening. Stick around after the credits for a quick postscript, an update for where I'm at now, and also Season 3. Our episode today is written, edited, and produced by me, Jonathan Wright. Music is by Taylor Swindells of Neighborhood Libraries. Thanks to Emily Rogers and Matt Rogers. Thanks also to Matthew Lee, Jared Ing, Rebecca Wright, and Ian Wright. This is the last episode of Season 2, but I'm not stopping here. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at hellounknownpod@gmail.com or just write it in the podcast comments. And if you like what you heard today, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. That's how more people get to hear us. So, I wrote this episode in November of 2022, a while ago. I just sold my firm a couple months before, and I basically decided I'd take a year to just write. So much has changed since then, of course, including the fact that, drum roll, I am a lawyer again. A lawyer, a partner at a firm called Ritchie, Quo & Wright, working now in much better, far more life-giving circumstances than I really ever had when it was just me. Anyway, I toyed with changing this episode, with updating it to the present, but it really is a fairly perfect time capsule of where I was at 2 years ago. So instead, I'm just adding this little addendum and otherwise leaving it as I'd written it. As for what has happened since, well, there will be a season 3. If you've enjoyed walking with me through the unknown these past 2 seasons, then stick around. Thank you all for listening. I'll send you off with the Bermuda Railway Trail.